All right, so today we're talking about composition, and I really like to start with this quote because it sort of helps reiterate that we're not just talking about the way that the objects are seen in the frame, but we're talking about a decision that we need to make about how we want those components to appear. So we are going to learn in this class about a lot of different decisions that we need to make in order to create the photos that we want to create. And composition is really sort of the overarching idea of that, where we start to talk about all of these elements and then deal with these elements in a way that we want to. So here are some of the elements of composition we're going to talk about. And these are just sort of guidelines. They're not really hard, fast rules. They're not really, they're not like check boxes that we have to check off. They're kind of things to think about and things to keep in mind when you're creating your photos. And we're going to kind of go through each one of these. So first and foremost, you need to think about what is the photo about? What is the subject? What supports that subject? What details do you want to kind of bring in to show off that subject? How are you going to utilize that, right? Every little thing matters. Every little thing is going to help us sort of draw that out. So the next thing you really need to think about, or the thing you need to think about before you really click the shutter, is what format do you want to shoot this in, right? The shape and orientation of the image. Is it going to be vertical? Is it going to be horizontal? Is it going to be square? This needs to be kept in mind when you're taking the photo so that you orient the camera correctly to utilize all of the pixels that you can utilize. If you shoot horizontal and then end up making it a vertical, you're going to kind of clip off a lot of pixels on the sides, and you're not going to be utilizing every bit of the technology in your camera. So kind of something to think about. And you know, if you're even in doubt, then you can shoot both horizontal and vertical. And really everything falls into these three categories. So if you were to say, well, I like to shoot panoramas. Well, your panoramas are either really long horizontals or really tall verticals, right? There is only three elements that we can deal with when it comes to format. And so think about those. When I shoot professionally, I have to think about it because if I want to have a cover shot, like if I'm shooting a home or a space and and it's for a magazine and I want it to possibly be on the cover, then I have to shoot a vertical because covers are not horizontal. And if I want to sort of maximize sort of a double page spread, then I have to think about shooting horizontals as well. And so I have to kind of think about this when I'm taking the photos so that I can have a variety of things so that my photos can be utilized to the best of their ability. The next one we're going to talk about is the rule of thirds. And this one is probably the one that's going to come up the most for you guys. And this is sort of the biggest general rule of composition that I use all the time. And that's to kind of think about how you're putting that image or that subject in your frame. And, you know, it's sort of natural for us to want to put it right in the center. And that becomes sort of like a target, right? And it draws our attention right into that element that's in the center. And it's sort of like a magnet. It kind of sticks us to it right there in the center. And so the rule of thirds really just says to divide your frame into a 3x3 grid and then move your subjects to the intersections of that grid. And so if we do that, you can see we kind of pull that rock formation out of the center of the image and we put it down into one of the intersections of the grid, and it sort of opens the image up. Start to think about how your eye moves around this image, right? So now our eye kind of moves. It goes through the rock formation and up into the sky and across those clouds. And then we kind of catch that hill down along the right. And that hill line sort of draws us back into the rock formation. And our eye continues to travel around. And you can see that all kind of falls nicely into that rule of thirds. The rock formation hits that intersection in the lower left. The line of clouds kind of moves right across the upper third of the image. And our horizon line is in the lower third of our image. And so everything kind of balances out nicely. The rule of thirds is a way to organize your image, and it's really based on this idea that it's more comfortable to look at an image that is not centered in the frame, that is kind of pulled to these outside edges. And so the rule of thirds makes it easier or more comfortable for your viewer to look at your image, and therefore can help your viewer sort of take in the image in a better way. And really what we're talking about with all this composition stuff is, how do we get our viewer to spend a little bit more time on our image? I mean, think about how many images you see in a day. It is astronomical, the amount of images that come into our view and that we see day in and day out. And so what can you do to capture your viewer for just that split second longer, just a little bit more, to kind of get them to engage in your image for just a split second? Another thing to think about is your angle of view, the position that the camera is in relation to the central theme or the subject of the photograph. Most photos, I would say 90% plus of the photos are shot at eye level. And that's because, well, honestly, we're kind of lazy, right? We put the camera up to our eye, we take a picture, and that's it. Changing that angle of view, even ever so slightly, can really sort of engage the image a lot more. And I'm not talking about big, grand gestures. If you remember from the Cartier-Bresson video, The Decisive Moment, he talks about these little movements, these slight little movements that can change the way everything kind of works out. And so when I say low level or high level, I mean, you don't have to do the extremes. You can, but you don't have to. Just crouch down a little bit and see what happens to your image, or stand on your tiptoes and see what happens to your image. Just change that level. Move a little to the left, move a little to the right. Just kind of see what changes that can make. My kids were in a wedding a few years back, and I went to take pictures. I was not the photographer for the wedding, but I went to take pictures, and it was up at Big Bear, and it was in this beautiful garden that had this pretty tall fence around it. But beyond the fence were these sort of not so appealing 1970s condominiums. And what I found is that if I crouched down just about 6 inches below my eye level, that the fence was tall enough that it blocked out all of the condominium. So I was crouching down just that little bit and taking those pictures. And the photographer that was shooting the wedding was standing next to me shooting everything from eye level. When his photos came back, every single one of them had those condominiums in the background, and none of mine did. And the bride, who was my niece, ended up utilizing most of my photos instead of the photographer's photos because of that fact. Simple little things, just a little tiny change in the angle that you're shooting can really open up and make your photo that much more engaging. Now, you can go to the extremes, like worm's eye view, which would be getting all the way down onto the ground and shooting up. And that's going to make, your subject really kind of the hero. It's going to really emphasize your subject. So when you go to the extremes, it's really going to change sort of the way your subject engages. When we talk about this eye level, low level, high level, or moving a little left and right, we're just talking about kind of pulling the composition together. But these worm's eye and bird's eye views can really, really change sort of how you display all of this and how you really show your subject off. So worm's eye is going to make it really important. Bird's eye is going to do just the opposite and can really make your subject sort of less important and kind of make it meld into the frame a little bit more. Bird's eye can also be used really to show pattern and texture and sort of the overall alignment of everything. So play around with those points of view and angles of view and have some fun with it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is perspective. And really what we're talking about with perspective is that we need to represent a three-dimensional world in a two-dimensional medium, right? Photography is 2 dimensions. The world we shoot is 3 dimensions. We have 2 eyes and we see depth and perspective in everything that we do. We can move around and see how subjects relate differently to subjects behind them. In a photo, once we capture that frame, we've sort of pinned it to 2 dimensions. And so we need to use things to show off that we can that we have depth and dimensionality in our photo. And so there's two types of perspective that we utilize. And one of them is linear perspective, which really uses lines and draws our eye back into the image and shows that sort of vanishing point, and right, sort of draws us through the image. And then the other one we have is aerial perspective. And aerial perspective is really based on this idea that things that are closer to us usually appear to us darker and with more detail. And things that are further away are sort of hazy and have less detail, or lighter and have less detail. And so you can utilize those things to really kind of help draw your viewer through the image, right? Again, we're talking about kind of guiding our viewer's sight or line or gaze on how they move through the image. And so by using perspective, we can draw our viewer back to something or through the image, or help them travel through the image. Another way we do that is lines, right? We talked about that a little bit in that linear perspective, is that the lines kind of draw the viewer through the image. We can use other lines to do that. We can use physical lines, contrast areas in an image. Like this image, there's that S curve that runs through it. And it really kind of makes your viewer move through the image in that way. Straight lines reinforce depth, like we said in the linear perspective. Curved lines can show motion and movement. So you can utilize these lines to really, again, guide your viewer. And some of these lines can be implied, right? So if you have a person in your image, where they are looking becomes a line. That line of sight is a line that we want to follow. We're curious as the viewer, and we want to sort of see what they're seeing. We can use empty space or negative space in our image. This can suggest sort of calm or isolation. Another thing it does is it really gives the viewer's eye a place to rest, right? It kind of gives them a place to stop and take a breath. And so negative space can be really, really powerful in an image. And it's sometimes hard to remember that we can use negative space because we're thinking about our image and that we want to kind of fill that frame and utilize all of those spaces. But sometimes leaving a little empty space is kind of nice. Symmetry. Symmetry is really nice. It can be used to highlight form. It can emphasize depth, right? It can kind of help us with our linear perspective. And it really can kind of give our viewer a sense of organization and guide them through the shot. And symmetry really is just basically how the sides, left and right, top and bottom, top corner, bottom corners of an image relate to each other, right? And when we talk about symmetry, we're talking about a balance between those two halves of the photo. And it can be split in any way. Like I said, left or right, top or bottom, it can be diagonal. Any way that we want, we can break up that symmetry and we can kind of balance it out. It doesn't have to be exact, but it needs to sort of have that balance, right? So if we have something that sort of takes up some space and has some weight on one side of the image, we want to have something that takes up about the same amount of space or gives us about the same amount of weight on the other side of the image so that it balances out. In this image, it's almost identical. There's a little bit in the bottom corner where this window is a little bit different than this arch over here, but we still sort of have that same element that's kind of appearing in both of those places. And so symmetry can really be used to highlight form, give us depth and dimensionality. When we're dealing with all these things, you'll see how things will start to kind of relate to each other and intertwine with each other. You'll be thinking about the rule of thirds and suddenly symmetry will come up. You'll be thinking about the empty space and suddenly you're dealing with the rule of thirds. That's great. That's how composition works, is that it all kind of plays with each other and kind of works with each other. Less is more. Don't go into it thinking, I need to have symmetry and linear perspective and negative space and rule of thirds. Just go into it thinking, start with one element. Like go into it with rule of thirds. How am I going to include the rule of thirds in my photography with this? And then you'll see that other things will start to creep in. Lines will start to become a part of it. Perspective will start to become a part of it. Let it sort of organically happen. Don't go in there thinking I have to check all of these boxes. Go in and just work on one element and see how the other elements come into it. So for your assignment this week, you're going to be doing compositional photos. And I want you to try to take the pictures with your camera on manual mode and take 30 or more photos, right? Give yourself some space to play. Don't go out and shoot 100 photos, but go out and shoot 30 or 40 photos and then bring them into Lightroom and go through and sort them out and pick your 3 favorite images, and then you'll upload them to the discussion. When you upload them to the discussion, make sure you embed them in the discussion and that you include some information about what you were trying to achieve compositionally in your shot, and also include your exposure information. I want to know your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. And then once you've posted, go through and look at everybody else's work and comment on it. Let's have a little bit of a critique in the assignment. And when I talk about critique, what I'm talking about is be a little bit critical of everyone's photos. Talk about what you like and even what you don't like about the photos. And just keep it civil, right? This is about the photos. We're going to be critical of the photos. We're not talking about the person or the subject matter in the photo. We're just talking about the photos and the composition. They're going to put down what they were trying to achieve. Let them know if you think they succeeded in achieving that or not, and then give them a little insight of what you think they could have possibly done to maybe better achieve it, or why you think they absolutely did achieve what they thought they were going to achieve. And then come back and look at what people say about your photos. This is the benefit of a photo class, is that we can all sort of have this conversation with each other, and we get the feedback from each other in a safe environment. And so your assignment will be graded on the photos that you turned in, whether they're all labeled correctly, and that you gave comment on 2 of your classmates' photos.